It turns out there's a lot I want to tell you all about today. A number of things to discuss. It's been an amazing season here at Adat Shalom this month, an amazing season of B'nai Mitzvah. Last week we celebrated the Bar Mitzvah of Solly Naderwood. The week before that we celebrated the Bat Mitzvah of Elise Van Gelder. It's really been an amazing blessing to have all that youth and energy and family and simcha right here in our sanctuary. I can't help but feel energized from all of what's happened here in our community these past 2 Shabbatot, so I'll just dive right in. Here we go. Now, I've mentioned this before to a number of you in our community. I've started a podcast, and it's live. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple. Next up, we'll get it on YouTube, maybe some other platforms. If you have any recommendations, let me know. I've had some interesting early feedback about this podcast. Not about the first episode. That just went live this week in time for Shabbat, so I'm sure I'll get feedback on that soon. But interesting early feedback about the concept. So one stream of feedback is, wow, that's awesome, that's so exciting. And the second stream of feedback is, yeah, our past rabbi had a podcast. Kind of a been there, done that vibe on that one. So I do feel the need to talk about my podcast and why it's unique. First of all, so you all are aware, the name of the podcast is Beyond the Shtetl. Of course, I want you all to listen and share with your family and friends, but I also want you to know it's really geared towards our community specifically. The potential audience, of course, is anyone ever who can listen to the English language and is interested in Jewish life, but the intended audience is you, is us. So there's 1 episode live, 2 more episodes planned. The first of those 2 we've set a date to record, which is coming up next month. And as I look ahead to the future of this podcast, the content is very much inspired by our community, by our community's unique and particular experience of Jewish life in West LA. And the content is intended also to be educational, to teach our community, and to teach anyone who can listen to the English language and is interested in Jewish life about different topics within Judaism. So the podcast, Beyond the Shtetl, it's cultural and educational. And I want to tell you about the first episode and why I'm releasing it now, why I'm releasing it this week. So first I have to tell you, I don't really consider myself a creative or an artist. I've got artists on both sides of my family. I know that's not really how my brain works, but it turns out launching a podcast is a creative project. And it has taught me some humbling truths about the creative process. And the first truth among those humbling truths is creative projects are on a schedule of their own. This first episode of Beyond the Shtetl, it's about interfaith families and interfaith relationships. And the idea for this emerged this past December during the Hanukkah and Christmas season, as I was having conversations with people in our community who, like me, are deeply engaged in and committed to Jewish life, and, like me, have people in their lives they're close to, people they love, who aren't Jewish. And I don't know if any of you remember, but also at that time, this past December, the conservative movement was releasing new statements on the topic and the question of intermarriage. So there was a lot on our minds at that point in time a few months ago. I didn't record the episode until January, and due to various technical things about producing a podcast, which I now know a whole lot more about than I did 2 months ago, due to those things, I couldn't release the podcast episode until this week. But now, it's just in time for Pesach. And we do talk about Pesach and other holidays in this podcast episode. Specifically, we talk about the holidays that touch most on the experiences and emotions we have with our families. So it turns out, the timing worked out okay after all, because I'm relatively confident that in the week ahead, most or all of us will be doing something related to preparing for Pesach, maybe shopping, maybe cleaning, maybe just traveling. And so most or all of us will have the opportunity to listen to a podcast episode as we do one or more of those things. I hope we'll have a chance to listen as we get ready for the holiday, and I hope the conversation you hear in the episode will inspire discussion with your friends and your family. So that's the podcast, Beyond the Shtetl. That's the first thing I wanted to tell you all about today. And it brings me to the second thing, the name of this Shabbat, Shabbat Hagadol. Every year this Shabbat inspires the question, and I heard it from some of you as the service began. It's really an absolutely mystifying question. What is Shabbat Hagadol? The reason why the question is so mystifying, I think, is because the answer is really just too simple. It's the Shabbat before Pesach. It's the Shabbat immediately preceding the Seders. Not only is that answer too simple, this Shabbat, Shabbat HaGadol, doesn't even have a special Maftir Torah reading from a second scroll. We've had special Maftir readings off and on for like the last 2 months, and now Shabbat HaGadol, there's nothing? It makes a person think, doesn't Shabbat HaGadol mean the Great Shabbat? How is it a thing that all of these other Shabbatot have special Maftir readings, and this Shabbat, the Great Shabbat, does not? It's a valid question. How is this a thing? Well, we can at least say about Shabbat HaGadol, it has a special Haftorah. We read it from the book of Malachi. Sammy read it for us so beautifully, and it concludes the verse, Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Adonai hagadol v'hanorah. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of God. And when we read the Haftorah, it's customary to read that verse twice. The reason is we want to conclude our Haftorah on a positive note. We don't know what exactly it will be like when God sends us Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day, but we have the sense that it'll be a good thing, even a great thing, something gadol. And it's also true that Elijah the prophet has a special moment at our Passover Seder, near the end, when we open the door for Elijah, ready to welcome him in. This is a moment when we pray for redemption. We open ourselves to the idea that God can intervene in our lives and in the world and make everything better. So this concept of redemption, it can be inspirational for some, it can be frustrating for others. After all, if God can intervene in our lives, if Elijah can show up when we open the door, why hasn't it happened yet? No? Which brings us to yet another meaning of Shabbat HaGadol, a lot more tachlis, practical, and perhaps a bit more sensible for some of us. Shabbat HaGadol is part of a pair of Shabbatot, which are spaced about 6 months apart. The other in this pair is Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat immediately preceding Yom Kippur. And on these 2 Shabbatot, Shabbat HaGadol and Shabbat Shuvah, the rabbi of the community would customarily give an extended sermon, an extended teaching, to ensure the community would be educated on the specific observances of the upcoming holiday. Now, when I first learned about Shabbat HaGadol, that's the meaning that I learned. Now, fortunately for this custom of extended sermons did not exactly catch on in the conservative movement. But for your reference and for your edification, these 2 Shabbatot, Shabbat HaGadol and Shabbat Shuvah, are a pair. The extended sermon is an established custom, even though it's one that we here generally don't follow. So Shabbat HaGadol, right before Pesach, special Haftorah, good time for the rabbi to speak to the community about how to observe Pesach. Extended sermons are not okay. We've got a variety of ways to understand what this day, what the Shabbat is all about. But this year, I don't know if this year more people asked me about it, and so I did different research. Maybe Google's new algorithm or AI is refining my searches without me knowing it. But this year, I learned something new about Shabbat HaGadol that I've never learned before. But it's not a new interpretation. It comes from the Shulchan Aruch, the single most authoritative code on Jewish law, and specifically it comes from the textual gloss, that is the commentary, provided by Rabbi Moses Isserles, who is best known by his rabbi nickname, the Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch was actually written by Rabbi Joseph Caro in the 16th century, and it follows a Sephardic tradition. It was a masterwork from the get-go. It caught on very quickly for the broader Jewish community. And so right away, Rabbi Moses Isserles, the Ramah, came along and added his additions, following Ashkenazic customs, in the places where the 2 traditions vary. So the Ramah has this custom for Shabbat HaGadol. We're supposed to study a certain portion of the Haggadah, and apparently the specified time for when we should do this study is Shabbat afternoon. So if you want to, you can go home today and do this at the appropriate time. Sidebar, I highly, highly recommend studying the Haggadah, especially at the overview level. I'm already brainstorming a podcast episode for next year, but I further digress. I really do recommend sitting down and studying the Haggadah. Interestingly, it's not something that I studied in rabbinical school. I started studying it in detail out of the context of Seder preparation only about 4 years ago. And since then, I've taught it to a variety of students. My 9th graders at D. Toledo High School, my religious school class this month before we went on Pesach break. Highly recommend a study of that. So I'll end that sidebar. So the section that the Ramah instructs us to study is part of the Magid section of the Haggadah, which is the longest section. So my student Ethan this year helped me to learn that what I mean by the longest is it's the longest in terms of text. He pointed out that the meal, Shulchan Aruch, might be the longest in terms of time. Okay, so it's the longest section in terms of text in the Haggadah. And the Ramah instructs us to study a selection of that, the selection that begins with Avadim Hayinu, and it concludes with a paragraph following the song that we know and love, Dayenu. That paragraph after Dayenu begins with the words Alachat Kama V'chama, how much more so, and it concludes before the new section which explains Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Rabbi Rebecca Blady explains about this section that the Ramah instructs us to study. It's the essence of the story of Passover. We were enslaved in Egypt. God brought plagues upon our Egyptian taskmasters and freed us with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Then God gave us Shabbat and the Torah. God brought us into Israel and provided us with the holy temple, with a way to connect to God through ritual. This specific selection of the Haggadah that we're supposed to study today on Shabbat Haggadol is the selection that tells the story of our people, of our relationship with history and our relationship with God. Which brings me to the third and final thing I wanted to talk to you all about today. First, the podcast Beyond the Shtetl. Second, Shabbat Haggadol, what it is and what it means. And the third and final thing, this week's parasha, Parashat Tzav. So last week on Shabbat at Kiddush, I had a conversation about this week's parasha that I really didn't expect to have. After all, the conversation was a week early about the upcoming parasha, and the conversation started something like this. Rabbi, did you know that Tzav is not only the name of a parasha, it's also the Hebrew word for turtle? And I said, no, I did not know that until this exact moment. It turns out that Tzav, as in this week's parasha, is spelled Tzadi Vav, and Tzav, as in turtle, is spelled Tzadi Vet. And then in this conversation I had last week, of course, I had to say out loud, there's a drash in there somewhere. So this week, I find myself thinking about this, and I'm thinking Shabbat Haggadol, Chametz and Matzah, turtles. This is all going to tie together somehow. So here's what I've got. Tzav, as in the parasha, is the same root word as the word mitzvah, which most commonly and accurately translates as commandment. Some commandments are things that we shouldn't do, prohibitions. Some commandments are things that we should do, imperatives. But they're not suggestions. They're instructions. But there is this drash out there, this interpretation, that a mitzvah isn't just a commandment, it's also a connection, which brings me, of course, back to turtles. This person who taught me that tzav is the Hebrew word for turtle, this person is a big fan of turtles. This person has a pet turtle. This person thinks about turtles and their needs in life and well-being much more than I do on an average day. This person has a connection with turtles, a special relationship. Our mitzvot, our commandments, they're not intended to be busy work. They're intended to be opportunities for connection and relationship. That's why a mitzvah doesn't just mean commandment, it also means a good deed, an action that can connect one human being to another and can connect us humans, us Jews, to the force or the entity or the being that does the commanding, that is, to God. Shabbat Haggadol reminds us that Passover is almost here. Passover is full of Jewish things to do, instructions and commandments to follow. Passover is full of gathering, relationship, family, and friends. Both of these things are joyful, and both these things sometimes can be just a little bit overwhelming. But we can learn from the turtle. We can choose to breathe into the overwhelm and prioritize this connection and this relationship. We can follow the Shabbat Haggadol custom of the Ramah and study the Haggadah this afternoon, specifically the section that tells the story of our people, focusing on our relationship with our history, with one another, and with God. We can think about our families and our friends and appreciate them for being lovely, imperfect, frustrating, and for bringing us a deep and irreplaceable joy. And if you need a little reminder that you're not alone in this mix of feelings, you can check out the podcast. In the week ahead, we'll have our Seders. We'll come together as a community here in our sanctuary for Yom Tov services Thursday and Friday, and then again on Shabbat. I look forward to seeing you all in this special week ahead and hearing your stories of celebration, connection, and relationship. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom.